As Greg said, I'm Pastor Keith Anderson, and I serve at Upper Dublin Lutheran Church in Ambler, which is just about 15 minutes north of here. And I think a lot about digital ministry and the intersection of kind of traditional, classic ministry practices and the way that they intersect with new digital technologies. One of the ways that I've started to think about that is a kind of a reverse engineering of the church. In that we're looking at what is happening in our culture and in our world, whether it's technologically or culturally, the ways that people communicate, the ways that they connect, the ways that they give, which are all in flux and shifting, and figuring out how, as the church, we connect with that. How do we speak the languages that not only the people that we want to reach who are beyond our churches, but the people who are in our churches speak? Whether that's technological languages or languages about giving or mission or vocation, what their passions might be. And it's not to say that we just sort of give over to whatever the technology and the culture offer us. We engage with it critically, but how do we engage with it? And it's awkward, and it's messy, and it's sacramental, and it's beautiful, and frustrating, and confusing, and amazing, all at the same time. In their book Networked, Lee Rainey and Barry Wellman describe what we're living through in this time as the triple revolution. It's the revolution of the internet, which is only 26 years old, still very new technology. So the revolution of the internet, the revolution of social media, being able to connect and build these relationships through these digital platforms, and mobile devices as well. So internet, social, and mobile, all happening at the same time. And so we're not just figuring out one revolution, we're figuring out three revolutions at the same time. This is an image that I like to share often from NBC News, and it's the top pane from 2005 was when Pope John Paul II had died, and that was his funeral in St. Peter's Square. And then 2013 is when Pope Francis was introduced as the new pope. And in just those 8 years, you can see how quickly the technology has changed. It's a little crop. So in 2005, there are a couple people with flip phones, that were the early adopters with the flip phone and the very basic internet connection. And then down in 2013 in St. Peter's Square, it was just a sea of digital devices, right? So people are capturing video, pictures, selfies, and they're broadcasting and sharing this immense religious event. So we're seeing that not just through the eyes of mainstream media, but we're seeing it through the eyes of everyday people who are right there on the ground. So just to give you a sense, in 2005, Facebook had existed for 1 year, but it was only for people with certain college email addresses. And now a lot of colleges don't even hand out email addresses anymore. The iPhone was still 2 years away. The popularization of the smartphone was still 2 years off. And so we're living through this time of immense, rapid change. And I think it's important to name that because we're all figuring it out as we go. Adam's figuring it out, he's figuring it out, I'm figuring it out, you're all figuring it out because it's all new still, and it's changing, right? I think about the days we often so the revolution of social media and the internet to the printing press. You imagine the early years of the printing press just trying to figure out how to use this new technology, right? So we've got this, what do we do with it? And how do we use it for the sake of the gospel? And that's the question that we're asking here. So thinking about what's helpful when I think about Adam's work, and he talks about crowdfunding, it's like that is a form of generosity and giving that is already happening in our culture, right? That is happening, and that is a reality. So how can we as churches think about how we could experiment with that, how we can invite a broader constituency into supporting the missions and the ministries and the causes that we care about? Or people in my congregation are connecting on Facebook, or they're connecting on Instagram. This is a meaningful part of how they live their everyday lives. I want to be part of that as a pastor. So how do I figure out how to go about that? So just some statistics, because you needed to be sleepier after lunch, just to kind of give us a sense of where people are in terms of these digital technologies. And this all comes from Pew Research, and some of it's a couple years old, so you can imagine the numbers are higher now. But 87% of American adults are online, 71% access the internet daily, 68% connect through a mobile device. 72% of online adults are on Facebook. That's 62% of the entire US population. I imagine that's higher now. But also after Facebook, which is the largest social network in the US and around the world, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Instagram, and Twitter also have healthy constituencies. And 52% of people are on 2 or more of those networks, right? So people are, mostly on Facebook, and they're dabbling on Instagram, or they're trying out Twitter, or maybe they keep an occasional blog, or do videos. And so one of the reasons I like to share statistics, even though they can be kind of create this glaze, over everybody, is that oftentimes we think of our own technology use as normative, right? So you think, I use technology in a certain way, and people are more or less like me. They might use it a little less, they might use it a little more. And sometimes these statistics are a help to say this is what's really happening, and sometimes they challenge our assumptions about how people are using the technologies and how they're connecting. But it's not only social media that people are engaged in every day. We're living these digitally integrated lives, right? So 89% of Americans carry a cell phone, 81% text message. People get directions. If you came here today, maybe you used a GPS on your phone to get here. Maybe you used your phone as your alarm clock. Maybe you used it to remind you to take out the trash like I did last night. People listen to music on their phones. They watch video, they take and upload pictures, right? So it's not just, when we think about technology, the hot thing is social media, so we think about social media, but it's also important just to appreciate the ways that these technologies are deeply integrated now, parts of our everyday lives, right? If I didn't have my phone, I would be in real trouble. It's all on there, and my laptop was in the Apple store for 2 days getting repaired, and I was like, what am I don't even know what to do with myself. It's all right there. In addition to that, what's really interesting to me, and this is a Pew study that came out this year in 2016, what we're seeing is the kind of emergence of what people call the digital economy, or the sharing economy, or the gig economy, where a lot of these social collaborative mobile tools are being used in really interesting ways. So services like Uber and Lyft, where you have an app on your phone and you register and have your card information on file, and you call a car by somebody that drives their own private vehicle to come in and pick you up and take you somewhere, right? That is it. Uber is really redefining, I think, what we think of as kind of these mobile technologies, or technologies like Airbnb that a friend just stayed at last night. She was telling me, Sarah was at Airbnb last night, where people open up rooms or parts of their homes for rent through the website. And so 15% of Americans have used something like Uber and Lyft car services, 11% Airbnb. 22% of adults have done crowdfunding sites, and I think from the raising of hands from your earlier presentation, it seems like we're probably above average in that way. But it's still a fairly new idea. So people who are familiar with those terms, crowdfunding, 39% of Americans are familiar with that term. That still seems pretty low. Sharing economy, 27, and gig economy, 11. And on the side, you'll see some of the different platforms they talk about. So in terms of shared or on-demand online services, also includes things like Etsy, for people that have their own store on Etsy for arts and crafts, or using something like Amazon Prime to get expedited delivery, which I'm addicted to, or secondhand goods online like eBay, or purchasing tickets from an online reseller like StubHub or SeatGeek or something like that. So this is kind of this emerging part of, or emerging face of our economy going forward, and I think that has really important implications for stewardship in the way that we think about how people use money, spend money, and share their resources with one another. This slide, which is kind of a classic meme that goes around sometimes from IBM, describes the way the digital disruption has already happened. The world's largest taxi company doesn't own any cars. The largest accommodation provider owns no real estate, Airbnb. The world's largest movie house has no cinemas, Netflix. The largest software vendors don't write the apps. Well, yes, they write some apps, but most of the apps are written by other people. So these are massive shifts in the ways that we kind of operate in our everyday lives. What's also interesting in that Pew study is they gave some reasons why people participate in crowdfunding, which I think is helpful if you're thinking about crowdfunding, but also when you think about the ways and what motivates people to give in congregations as well. So the top ones were to help people in need, to fund new products or inventions for a school, for a musician or a creative artist, to fund a business. Those were the top reasons people gave for participating in a crowdfunding thing. And then what they discovered too, the motivations are different between men and women. So women are more likely to donate when it's helping somebody in need, and men are more likely to donate when it's to create a new project or invention. So yeah, that's all new data this year. So when you think about, you're always constantly thinking about in stewardship time, what are the layers of messages that we're putting out there, and who are we reaching with those messages? And we recognize that people give for all sorts of reasons, from the old school and new school and every other school. And so people are all differently motivated to give and to support the mission of our ministries, our congregations, and our causes. So it's kind of helpful to see that statistically, what people find compelling in those projects. What I'm kind of realizing is in my work in writing online and books about the role of technology in ministry is that I guess what I've been sort of engaged in is kind of this ethnography of digital ministry. One of the things, and my story with that is kind of very digitally oriented. I meet most of the people in my life digitally first before I ever meet them in person, and that's how I met my co-author, Elizabeth Drescher, on Click to Save. And both of these books and other things I do online have been interviewing ministry leaders from around the church and asking them, what is the intersection of social media and ministry for you? Or how are you experiencing these shifts? Or what does this question look like in your context? Would you tell me more about it? It looks like you're doing something really interesting with that. Could you tell me why? And a lot of times, it's the first time somebody's asked. Because when we're engaging with these social media, we're just doing it, and in my own parish experience starting out, just doing it to figure out if it has any traction, right? We're just kind of doing it because it needs to be done, because it seems to have some promise, and I get to be the person that says, that looks really interesting, tell me more about that. And it has lifted up all these really interesting things. So we started research on Click to Save in 2011, so it really started kind of following a kind of a set of people and then an emerging group of people in their ministries and seeing how their use of technology has evolved over time and what that's meant for them, not only in these digital platforms, but in kind of the weekly rhythm of their congregational or their community life. So Adam is somebody that we interviewed in 2011 and have been able to follow now in what he's doing. And I'm happy to say that we're actually working on a second edition of Click to Save, where we're going to have new platforms, and we've already interviewed Adam and Mihi for it, to bring their voices back in and in for the first time. And so what I wanted to share a little bit is kind of over these last 5 years, some of the stories that I've encountered along the way, and to reflect on how the mission of the congregation or the character of the congregation really plays out into stewardship spaces. With some help from Adam's research. So one of the congregations and one of the stories I just loved came from Holy Spirit Lutheran Church in Kirkland, Washington. And they created this stewardship campaign called HSLC in the World. The story goes, the stewardship committee was meeting in the early fall and figuring out what is the theme going to be this year. And they had been doing a book study in Lent with Barbara Brown Taylor's An Altar in the World, which is an amazing book. And they said, what if we did something like Holy Spirit Lutheran Church in the World? And so they picked this theme. They created a hashtag, And they said, we're going to send out, along with all the stewardship materials, the letter and the envelope and everything, we're going to send out these orange pennants with the logo of the church on it. And we're going to ask people to take these out into the world in the places that they see the Holy Spirit at work. And we're going to invite them to post these pictures, whether it's on Twitter with a hashtag, or Facebook, or on their Facebook page, or to email it in, or to put it on the bulletin board. And they had teenagers in the narthex who would help people get the pictures off their photo, SD cards, and download it and print it. And so they took into account the whole range of technologies, right? So from the technologically sophisticated all the way down to, I don't know how to get my pictures off this camera. Can you help me? And so they sent these out, and she said, well, at first it wasn't what we expected. Everybody was taking pictures of themselves with it inside the church building. And I said, no, that's not the point. You have to go out. You have to go out. And so people started doing that. And so it's kind of a play on words, right? So it's where the Holy Spirit was at work in the world, where people found God in their everyday lives, and also where they saw their church at work in the world. And they said it completely went viral in their congregation, that people loved being able to tell these stories, and the pastors loved that everybody else was creating the content for them. And it went well beyond the stewardship campaign. So it went on for months and months and months. People traveled during the summers, and they would take these with them and take pictures of themselves, in Europe and different places. And it became this theme. And what's great about it in a couple ways was it was a way of, as she says here, engaging people and helping them feel connected, in a time when membership isn't quite what it used to be, and attendance definitely isn't what it used to be, and regular attendance is much less frequent than every week, oftentimes. It was a way of keeping people connected during the week and to help them to tell those stories. And it was a real affirmation of vocation in everyday life. So stewardship is, and the work of their church is not just something that happens at a certain time at a certain place, but is wherever they are and wherever God is, which is everywhere. One of the congregations I follow, because the pastor is a very good friend of mine, Mark Huber at Sanctuary Church in Marshfield, Massachusetts, which is a Lutheran church and a Methodist church. It's an old Methodist church, and there's a Methodist and a Lutheran mission start in the same small town. And there was a Methodist church that was dying. And they said, well, maybe we should do something together on this. And they did, and they closed the congregation, and they have a joint mission start, which has now become a full congregation. And one of the things that I've kind of interviewed Mark about and talked with Mark about over the years is how they're building a congregation that reaches a lot of people who have been religiously unaffiliated or not connected to a church for a long, long time. Mark started the church by showing up at the local Starbucks day after day after day until they ever finally got a building. The first worship service I attended with them was on the back porch of somebody's house. And so one of the values they have at Sanctuary is creating a sacred and a safe space for people with a wide range of backgrounds, beliefs, values, and that they can all be held together in that space. And so as he says here, in this day and age, people hold a lot of conflicting belief systems. People are really comfortable holding all sorts of paradox and tension together. And was really proud of the fact that he had this parishioner and many parishioners that felt like they can bring who they are and what they believe into this space and not somehow feel that it's silly or inferior to everybody else. So they're creating this culture, this worship culture, this congregational community culture with people who are really new to the church, and figuring out what church means for them and what they believe. And for them has created a really interesting challenge when it comes to stewardship. So if you can't even assume the old school, then how do you talk about stewardship? And if you're a mission congregation and the expectation is that you are going to become self-sustaining, then how do you get to that point? And one of the interesting things I'm sure it happens other places, but I haven't seen that before, is that they talk about shares, using the terminology of buying church shares. So like a CSA, like where you would buy a share in a CSA, so that you would buy a share, and on their website it would have buy a share of the church, or buy many shares, or buy half a share, or a quarter of a share, or share a share. but some way of thinking of helping people to think about in a language that is becoming more, more familiar with community agriculture, buying into a share of the congregation. And I said, you got to tell me more about this. And just quickly he said, long story short, our average giver is young, hasn't ever actively given to a religious organization, has little theological background about stewardship. Shares help us both define expectations and participation while also opening up an entry point for stewardship and generosity conversations. That was a really interesting way. And he said it's going pretty well. And so one of the things that sort of I'm learning and following Mark's work and other congregations that I'll talk about as well is that the way that they do stewardship is a direct reflection on the way that they are trying to be church. So they're trying to create a church and a faith community and an experience for people at Sanctuary that has some definition, right? That doesn't give away kind of who they are, either in their Methodist identity or their Lutheran identity, but at the same time creates an expansive enough space for people that they can hold this space together with all of their whole variety of backgrounds, belief, or lack of background or belief. And they're approaching stewardship in kind of the same way, that there is some expectation. We do need to support the ministry that happens here, but why don't you consider shares, in investing and owning the ministry of this church? And they also do amazing things with paper chains, as you can see in that picture. That's a really big window, and they do some incredible. It's kind of seems funny to say, paper chain artwork in that space with adults and youth and kids. And the stuff that they do is a very artistic community, so I love that picture. One of the congregations that has really been a huge inspiration for me along the way is Humble Walk Lutheran Church in St. Paul, and really was the inspiration for this idea of the book, The Digital Cathedral, and the ways that they were present in their local neighborhood and also in digital spaces. Humble Walk is a church without walls. So they don't aspire to have a church building. They do most of their gatherings in the local pub and the coffee shop. And I think now they're worshiping in a Jewish retirement home. And they're embedded in the west end of St. Paul. That's really where they want to be deeply rooted, in the specific West End neighborhood of St. Paul, Minnesota. And we interviewed Jody back in 2011. And 2011 seems like this kind of magical time in social media when we're all just figuring it out and so full of optimism about what all this could mean. And I feel like we're way more sophisticated and we're way more cynical than we used to be about social media. So when people just call you up out of the blue and say, tell me what you're doing. But we're also in 2011 when we talked to people, we were all very kind of amazed at what the technologies could do themselves and amazed at what they would allow us to do, And so Jody said, here we are, a church without walls, meet in the coffee shop, meet in the pub, don't have a central gathering place, don't have an office. And she said, to my surprise, Facebook, email, and texting has been the place where I am most present for people. She said, it's all technology-based, and I would have never dreamed that would have been my most consistent presence as a pastor, but it really is how it happened and how it continues to happen. And I think that's true for many of us, no matter your setting. As Mihi was saying, doing pastoral care by text really felt like cheating for a long time, because I really should be coming to your house, or at least having a phone conversation. But people said, no, this is good. This is how I want to connect with you. So pastoral care through Facebook messaging or texting or Twitter, if that's how people want to reach out, if that's how people want to connect, then I'm happy to do that in that way for them. But it still makes me a little, yeah. And so Humble Walk, over these last several years, has been living into what that means for them. And their pub gatherings are, in fact, much larger than their Sunday morning gatherings, which is really interesting. So they do beer and hymns on a regular basis, Bible study, and so the beer and hymn gatherings are way bigger than Sunday morning worship. And Jody says, well, and people come up to me and say, well, this is my church. And she said, good. One of the stories in the book I'll never forget was I actually was in St. Paul, and she told me the story over lunch, and then later on I said, you have to tell me that again. I have to kind of capture that. She said, we've been showing up at the pub so much that at the Shamrock so much that we just became part of the fabric of that place. And she said that one of the young men who was one of the bouncers there died suddenly. And the staff was just completely torn up about it, so sad. And so when Humble Walk was gathered there for one of their events, as things were winding down, she noticed the server was just didn't seem himself, and asked him how he was doing, and he kind of told her this story. And he said, do you think we could pray about it? And she said, yeah, we could pray, thinking, I'm just going to pray with this guy right here. And then he went back and got all of the staff from the pub out, and they stood around in a circle, and they shared stories about him, and they prayed together. So there's this deepening of connection that happens when you keep showing up in these local spaces and you keep showing up in these digital spaces. That trust, that trust that we have to earn now as institutions, and sometimes just as Christians and people of faith, starts to develop. So Adam covered one of the projects that Humble Walk did more recently. They did a crowd-funded Kickstarter campaign. And what they were doing was they wanted to fund this campaign to create this CD, Storm Home, with original music that they have used in their worship space. They want to commission the artists and have that music in their worship, and then make it available to other people. And so Adam chronicles this in the Christian Century article that he wrote, A Broader Appeal. They raised $9,000 in 32 days on Kickstarter. And as he points out, the video for the Kickstarter campaign was just shot with a smartphone. nothing special. And Jody said, artists got to write songs, our studio people got to do what they are created to do, we get to give it all away, and we got to invite others along in the process. And a number of the people that gave to that project, and some of whom really were leading funders of the project, were not members of that church at all, but were invested in the ministry that Humble Walk was doing, and really valued the artistry and the creativity that they bring to their ministry. And our song leaders later today, Joel and Amy Pakin, I don't know if they're here yet. They're going to do a song with us later in our closing liturgy. They're some of the artists that are on this CD. That happens. And so one of the things that sort of I take away from this, having served more traditional churches, is that there are ways to engage people about things that they are passionate about, and that may not exactly be funding our budgets or funding our overhead or funding our buildings or funding our staffing, but there are shared passions, whether it's for worship or music or creativity, that people can engage with us on. So, what would it look like in some of our congregations to do crowdfunding for things that were not for us, to partner with another organization, another cause, another congregation or community organization to support a Kickstarter campaign, just in part for the experience of having done it, but to engage a broader public in terms of projects that are of value to our communities or of value to the larger church. Sometimes when we think about stewardship, we really narrow it down to the budget, but generosity and giving, of course, go far beyond that. So how can we engage people in this kind of generosity and giving and discover shared passions and commitments to whatever these projects might be? One of the things that is also really important, I think, in this project and in one of the projects I'm going to talk about from St. Lydia's, is that the congregations that I've followed are more like digital natives, but they're sort of networking natives. Like Humble Walk, like this project of raising $9,000 in 32 days just didn't happen out of the blue. They didn't just create a Kickstarter campaign and then kind of magically it was funded. Like, they had been working to network with their neighborhood. They've been working in sharing what they were learning online by writing blog posts and on Facebook, and in really being generous with what they were learning and what they are learning in their setting. And so that there's this larger constituency of church people, me included, who are following what they're doing and saying, I'm probably never going to do a mission start. I serve a very traditional congregation, but I'm learning so much from what they are doing and then reporting back out into social media. And so I'm deeply invested in the work that they're doing, though I live hundreds of miles away and in a very different context. And so when they said, we want to do this project, there were people that they were connected to well beyond their congregation who were passionate about the ministry that they're doing and the music that they do. St. Lydia's Dinner Church, for me, is it's a wonderful ministry in Brooklyn, and it's also, I think, one of the leading lights in terms of how we think about kind of a hybrid notion of stewardship. So when I interviewed Emily Scott back in 2011, I don't think she was ordained yet. They definitely didn't have their own space. It was a real kind of bootstrap congregation. They do dinner church, so Sunday nights, their main worship service is gathering around the table. So they prepare the meal, they set the tables, they share dinner together. This is their new space in Brooklyn. But again, it's a kind of new congregation, as we see at Sanctuary in Marshfield, and figuring out how do you encourage people to give, and then is there a broader set of stakeholders that we might be connected with to help us to grow? So when I interviewed Emily in 2011, she said, we're using social media and technology to advance what we're doing as a community, and yet a lot of what we do on Sunday night is really countercultural in terms of its engagement with technology. In some ways, we're engaging with a high-tech modern world, and in other ways, when you walk into our space, it's completely pre-technological. And they had the original website. I asked her tell me about your website, tell me, about your blog. And on their blog, they would share recipes from the dinners that they cooked together. They would share poems, they would share texts of sermons, which now they podcast on a brand new site. And she said those blog posts, she said, are the artifacts of our life together. And they're sharing that life with a broader audience through social media. So when it came time for them to really find their own space, their own storefront space in Brooklyn, they engaged in this Indiegogo crowdfunding project and invited people to ask if they could raise an additional $30,000 on a Kickstarter campaign to help with the money they've already raised to move into this new space. And Adam chronicles this too, so I'm stealing your stuff. When we're not in the same place, I can just steal your stuff all the time. They raised $33,000 from 263 funders and more than funded their project. And Emily, and Adam reports this, Emily said, everyone felt like they had a role to play, and the energy and excitement of the campaign was contagious. A campaign like this builds community in a serious way. A few days into the campaign, I realized that I wasn't the only one refreshing my browser every few minutes to see when the donations were coming. It was an exciting thing that community could participate in, and it built a lot of ownership. It was actually a remarkable thing to see happen in real time. Because Emily, anytime anybody gave, Emily would respond to them on Facebook or a social network and give them a thank you, image that she would create for each person. And so it took a lot of planning and it took a lot of time and response, but they reached their goal. And part of that, again, was that they were already, even in the early nascent days of their congregation, when they weren't even a congregation at all, they were thinking about how do we share our love of the Eucharist? How do we tell this story? And I tell you, they have, people are trying dinner church now. Dinner churches are popping up in different places. My last congregation and this congregation, we have done dinner churches as part of our programming, sort of trying it on and to see how it works. And so they've given the church, the larger church, a real gift. And people who are looking for a spiritual community, but just may not have found it in their local place, but may have found it online, through St. Lydia's. And so you have this kind of networked sense of being church that kind of comes back to them when they say, we have this project, and we're looking for help with it. So you can't just start, I think, social media, from my perspective, is a long-term play, because social media is all about relationships. And relationships, as we know, because we are in the relationship business, relationships take time, right? And they evolve and they change, and the important thing is to stay in relationship over time. And so you can't just go say, we need to fill a gap and create a Kickstarter campaign. You really do need to be in relationship over time with people, in broader and overlapping networks of people, I think, to make something like that happen. But creating a smaller project in which you can collaborate with people to try it on and to do something together that a wider audience would be passionate about seems really appealing and pretty doable. One of the best examples for me of the ways that we can share our spiritual gifts with a broader audience, the ways that we can connect with people, inspire people, share the gospel with people, but also create a community, a larger community of people who are invested in our mission, is the Society of St. John the Evangelist in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a place that I used to go in divinity school and would do silent retreats at quite often when I was still in Boston. And it's this small monastery on the Charles River in Cambridge, kind of surrounded entirely by Harvard, and you could at least walk by it and you would never know what's going on inside. It's very unassuming. But these monks are amazing, such deep spiritual wisdom, and people go there for retreats, for spiritual direction. They go for the services of this beautiful chanting. And so this jewel, this gem, this gift to the church that's just kind of quietly there, on the side of the river. And what they've done over the last several years is develop this digital footprint with the help of Jamie Coates, who directs the Friends of SSJE, which is kind of their development arm. And the way they started out doing it was kind of gleaning wisdom from the monks. So they would share their sermons online. They have a program and still have it called Brother Give Us a Word, where you can subscribe by email, and every day you get a word like peace, and then it would, with a little something from one of their sermons, and you get it every day. That's kind of in that old monastic tradition, Brother Give Us a Word. And they've done projects like #AdventWord, where a couple Advents ago, they invited people to share images from Advent every day, a different theme every day, and got tens of thousands of impressions across social media. And they're collaborating with Virginia Theological Seminary in their Center for the Ministry of Teaching to do videos of the monks. And Sarah was just telling me you're working on Lent almost 2018. The monks work ahead. Yes. So the monks don't go out and about. Like, they don't kind of, visit. You have to maintain that contemplative space, but they have found this way to mine the wisdom and the spirituality of the monks and to make it available to a larger audience, so that, as Jamie says, when we have a need, that audience knows about us, they care about us, they're invested in us, and would be willing to support us in some way. So he says, although I'm in charge of fundraising and communication, 95% of my job is figuring out how to give away the brothers' wisdom. How do we connect and give people wisdom that feeds them? If you understand, you truly live in the gift economy, he calls it, and you're truly giving away God's gift for the sake of God's love, then it flows back to you. Yeah. And I wonder about all the different ways in our congregations that we provide spiritual resources to people, and how can we make that available to people in a way that connects for them, whether it's in social media or it's by email or by text, right? We have all these resources. We have all these things we provide our congregations, but how are we sharing that with a broader audience, and that people want to connect with that? And not just podcasting your sermons, which is a really valuable service, but one of the things they do is they hire a student from Harvard to kind of be the chief note taker. So the monks give the sermons, and then the student is kind of listening for what are the phrases, what are the sentences that we could use for Brother Give Us a Word, which are basically tweet-length explanations about peace or hope or joy. And how can we kind of break down that content into kind of this 10-minute or 15-minute beautiful reflection, but that a lot of people don't have time for, right? And bring it down into something that's bite-sized, that people could get every day and be happy about it and not feel overwhelmed by it, and stay connected to us. Jamie is really one of the most amazing people that I've interviewed in the course of writing these books. And he truly does believe that if you give it away, it flows back. And that's sort of one of the nice things about social media. There's a lot that's not nice about social media, but one of the things about social media that I found is that if you're kind and generous, things really do flow back to you in one way or another. And we need to be witnesses to that in our work, in our digital ministry. One of the points of reflection for me in that was something that we did a year and a half ago, which was a collaboration with our local brew pub and a restaurant in town in Ambler. So we called it Brewing for the Greater Good. And what happened was we have a theology pub night. How many people do theology pubs here? Or coffee shop type, third place ministry stuff? So we do, the Upper Dubliners are right over here. We do a monthly theology pub at this local brew pub, Forest and Main Brewing Company in Ambler, which is great beer, great guys. And one of the times I went there, I saw on the menu that there was this beer, and if you bought this beer, part of the proceeds would go to a local food bank, the Mattie Dixon Food Cupboard, in case locals you may have heard of that. And I asked what the story was. I was like, that's pretty cool. What's the story behind that? And it turned out that Dan Endicott, the guy in the hat on the left up at the top, his brother died very suddenly at a young age in an accident. And one of the things his brother had done was create this garden at the Temple Ambler campus, which is not far from our church. And he said he actually discovered the place where Forrest and Maine now lives in this old Victorian house because he was taking food from that garden that his brother had created down to the Mattie Dixon Food Cupboard. And he saw that place and said, that's the place, aha, this aha moment. And so we were talking about all that whole story. And so learn that they're not just interested in brewing beer, they're really interested in forming community, and they're really interested in giving back to the community. And so I had this idea of what if we did a beer tasting for charity? Because we support the Mattie Dixon Food Cupboard, and you support Mattie Dixon, and they're right down the street from you. And could we do something together? And they said, well, yeah, we'll donate the beer. And we said, we'll donate all the organizational stuff. And we had 100 or more people come out for that. But, and a lot of just community people, not church people, come to that. And we raised over $3,000. And what it made me think about, I guess, in the context of this day and these talks, was kind of thinking more broadly about who are the stakeholders in our ministries and missions, right? Who are the stakeholders for us? Because, you can see, we have denominational stakeholders. Yeah, we have stakeholders who depend on us for support, for mission. If we give financially to them or we collect for them, we have those constituencies, ecumenical bodies. But I think one of our constituents now is the pub and the coffee shop that we go to twice a month. These are some of our church stakeholders now, which is a very different, for me, a different way of thinking about who's invested in the mission of our congregation. Because our mission about creating community and creating spaces for people to gather and connect and to be nurtured is also part of their mission, but in a different way. And so and the passion for giving back. So we were able to connect by keep showing up in this space again and again and again, and able to do something like this together. And hopefully we'll do it again. But who are the stakeholders in your ministries? And not just the members and not just the institutional bodies, but who's invested in your ministry? And whose causes are you invested in, too? Because I'm a stakeholder now in that pub. Because if that pub didn't exist, where would we meet? Or if that cafe decided not to host us anymore, where would we go? So we've become stakeholders for each other. So I think, as we think about crowdfunding, maybe we could think more broadly and expansively about who's invested in what we do and who we are invested in. One of the themes for me on that is cathedrals, which is like, I feel like I just have to say cathedral, cathedral, cathedral. I told my wife I should get a tattoo, because when you write a book called Digital Cathedral, most of the times you frame everything in the idea of a cathedral. But in the book, I talk about different dimensions of cathedrals. And I have just this love of cathedrals. We visited them. We traveled in Europe, visited a lot of the old cathedrals, some of the cathedrals here in the States. And cathedrals are just these amazing places because they're so big, they're so old. But what strikes me most about them is that they're so expansive, right? Not just in size, but in terms of who's welcome, who comes and why, how they're networked and connected, not just to a membership, if they even have a official membership at all, but the way that they're connected to artistic communities, the ways that they engage in sacred and secular partnerships. So they have this much broader sense of who has a stake in the life of the cathedral. And it's regional and it's national and oftentimes it's global. If I get one more email from Washington National Cathedral about giving money, I may unsubscribe. But they count me as a stakeholder because I visited, I did the tour, and I do care very much about it. But that's a lot of emails. But cathedrals. I mean, we're thinking about stewardship and hybrid models of stewardship. Cathedrals, get giving from a regular. If you have a membership like Washington National, there's regular giving from within the congregation. This is very mundane. There's the gift shop. There's online giving. There are people you're connected to much more broadly. And so there are grants and there are partnerships that happen and take place in cathedrals. So, how can we think about sort of our annual stewardship campaigns as one element or one stream of our giving or our mission? And so there's this expansive sense of belonging. There's an expansive sense of people who come for many different reasons and believe many different things. And there's an expansive notion of who is a part of the cathedral community and who can participate in supporting it. Tracy Lind at Trinity Episcopal Cathedral in Cleveland says, "I like to call the urban cathedral at its best a piazza, a place of celebration and culture and conversation and collaboration and even commerce." And I think a lot of the stories that we've heard today and maybe what we're embodying today a bit is that collaboration. And ministries that we heard in our panel that are a combination of churches and faith communities, worshiping communities, and nonprofits and social services and grant funding and giving from within. And all of those things have to be in play as we think about how we are the church and how we support how we're going to be as the church moving forward. Sometimes in the way we think about our churches is sometimes we think of our churches like this, a very simplified flow chart. Every time I show this slide, there's this knowing laughter, like, oh yeah, we have one of those somewhere. And it's good to have structure, and we have a church constitution, and all of that. But when we imagine our churches like this, or something like this, it tells us that our churches are predictable, they're hierarchical, they're linear, they're predictable. Did I say predictable already? And I said the last talk I gave, somebody said, yeah, and you put God in a box. Jesus is up there in a box. And so we think about our congregations this way. I think, we're really limited when we think about the life of our congregations, and maybe the way that we think about our stewardship. One of the other things that this graphic tells me is that the church is self-contained and self-sufficient unto itself, right? And so a better way to think about that in this kind of networked world we're living in is more like a network map. And I think if you serve a faith community, you know that it actually looks more like this than the flow chart, than the org chart, right? Like each dot would be a person, and then those people are connected to other people, or connected to other people, and these connections are being built all the time as people get to know each other, In congregations, they're changing as people become closer, or as a newer person comes into a congregation and they become more of a hub as they get to know more people. And then these lines are not self-contained, but these lines then go out to all of the other networks to which our congregational members are a part, right? So the network map does not sort of end here, but extends out. So there are these interconnected layers of networks that we're a part of. And one of the gifts for me of social media is inviting us to see ourselves not as this series of boxes, in an org chart, but a networked way of being church, right? That within our churches, we are a network of people. And that network extends out into all the other connections that you are a part of and all the other connections that I am a part of. And we have this much more expansive and dynamic idea of what a church is and what church does and who we are together than this kind of self-contained institutional organization that we sometimes think of as church. That's one of the gifts of hearing Adam and Mihi today and following their work over some time is appreciating the messiness of this time. Like, everything is in flux. Everything is up for grabs, right? It's terrifying. It is a terrifying time. What am I going to do the next 25 years in ministry? What's it going to look like? It's going to change lots and more than one time. And yet it's completely beautiful and amazing because there's so much opportunity. And sometimes we let the fear and the anxiety and the worry really get the best of us. And we have to find ways to keep that at bay by surrounding ourselves with people like we are today and living into and trusting that what God has in store will be done. And we need to trust each other and trust in God as we move forward. And to be willing to experiment and try things, and it's okay if they don't work. Oftentimes, we're so accustomed to when we do something, it's a finished product. The sermons are a finished product. My adult forums are never a finished product, but I try. Our confirmation lessons, somehow they're like finished products. I have to have it all ready before I put it out there. And the gift and the challenge of social media is that we're all learning as we go in public, which can be a really uncomfortable place. When I start a YouTube series and people say, that does not look good, well, you said that. The very person. That's a great idea, but you can't talk into your webcam like that the whole time. Yes. So it's my social media advisor, Katie, here. And so we're all learning as we go, and I think we just need to be kind of willing to launch ourselves into that space and wrap it up, Brad says. So Margaret Wheatley says, innovation is fostered by information gathered from new connections, from insights gained by journeys into other disciplines or places, from active collegial networks and fluid open boundaries. Knowledge grows inside relationships from ongoing circles of exchange where information is not just accumulated by individuals, but is willingly shared. Information-rich, ambiguous environments are the source of surprising new births. And I truly believe that is what we are in as the church now.